Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 28th week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. For a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was no platformed there. No platforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for more than half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's July 15th, in a week in which the crisis that our government has brought the world into seems ever clearer. It's a crisis for neoliberalism and neoconservatism after 40 years of those hidden political movements that have dominated American politics. By neoliberalism, I mean the policies of the 1% to use the government and law to increase their profits, concentrate wealth, reduce social supports, and prevent organization against them. By neoconservatism, I mean the policies of the 1% to use military force for the same purposes. What we see in the 40-year triumph of neoconservatism and neoliberalism is the working out of that military-industrial complex that departing President Eisenhower warned the U.S. of more than 50 years ago. Today, drone programs are perhaps the best example of the way in which the defense industries, even the euphemism is objectionable, the war industries keep the wars going for their own profit. This is never clearer, perhaps, than in what's been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of the modern world, that is President Obama's drone assassinations. The recent book by Andrew Coburn called Kill Chain, about the way in which the technological requirements of the profits of these major corporations drives American war making and drives America into war in ways that are indeed often even counter to the things that the national executive has in mind. These policies, neoliberalism and neoconservatism, were conscious reactions by the business community, by American capitalism, to the 60s, the explosion of democracy in the 1960s in America, and a rejection of 40 years of New Deal and Great Society amelioration of the harsh effects of modern capitalism. Neoliberalism and neoconservatism were a reverse of those things, an attempt to set them down. The rise of neoliberalism and neoconservatism is signaled by the 1975 academic study, The Crisis of Democracy. The crisis was that there was too much democracy around for a change, and something must be done to put it down in order to maintain the profits of the 1%. Now, I said that they've come into a crisis. I think so. The crisis has three aspects. First of all, a populist reaction to the austerity that neoliberalism has brought around the world, in America as well as in Europe, if more swingingly in Europe. From Trump to Sanders to Brexit to Le Pen in France and other analogs across the world, a reaction to neoliberal austerity is a political feature of the moment. Secondly, the terrorist reaction to neocon terrorism. The U.S., after all, invented radical Islam and jihadism in the 1970s in order to annoy the Russians, described in detail by President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. The reaction to the terrorism that the United States was sponsoring has led to such things as the atrocity in Nice in the last couple of days. Terrorist reaction to neocon terrorism is an aspect of the crisis. Even 9/11, of course, was a reaction, a counterattack to the terrorism that the U.S. had been responsible for throughout the Middle East in its attempt to control Middle East energy resources. Thirdly, the third aspect of the current crisis is the increasingly and amazingly aggressive provocations of Eurasia, of Russia and China, by the American government. That's at the very heart of the 1% strategy and has been longer indeed than neoliberalism and neoconservatism has existed. It goes back at least a century. But the present administration and probably the future administration, Mrs. Clinton's, are particularly aggressive in these immensely dangerous provocations, representing a third prong of the crisis of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So you're watching News from Neptune, a worse than you thought edition. And we'll begin with the man that Donald Trump has chosen for vice president, Ron Zoe.
Not quite. Although I assume they'll be...
You're as well known as he is.
Yeah, right. They'll be calling me, asking me for advice on how to run the country, of course.
Yep.
But,
Oh, well, that's what we do here, right?
right. So, like everyone else, I'll be talking about the election for a few minutes. Two classes of pundits who are telling us what it all means, I'll mention. One is the, I would say, somewhat more sophisticated people who are looking at the demographic calculus and saying that there are not enough older white men to elect Trump. These people, well, they cite the attractions of economics, which is the one that usually gets talked about here, their economic status. But there are these other psychological aspects of it that I don't take as seriously as I used to. I've begun to think that sociology is more important than psychology. But anyway, let that pass. You
know I won't.
Yeah, right. The resentment of among these what we might call Trump voters or whatever, of the white-collar professional class and their lifestyles, and scorning them for nibbling on broccoli quiche and drinking Chardonnay and so on. And this group is defiance of what is called political correctness. This always comes out up as a part of the bill of particulars of what's wrong with them. So that would be something deserving a program in itself. What is political correctness and what's so horrible about it? The right-wingers have their own version of political correctness, and you can see it displayed in the online Conservapedia and in the current Republican platform, which I'll come back to in a minute. But there have been many books trying to explain this right-wing phenomenon and the immense hostility to the liberals and Obama and so on. One I pointed out here earlier is some have analyzed the figures by social class, socioeconomic status, and pointed out the hostility apparently of the second quintile to the first quintile on moralistic grounds. Divide the population up into quintiles, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and so on. And why do so many people in the second quintile from the bottom seem to be voting against their own interests in so many cases? You can dispute whether that's really true, but in any case, that's the perception of a lot of observers. And the moralistic stuff is that those people in the first quintile from 0 to 20 are getting lots of undeserved benefits from the welfare state and from the liberals and Democrats in particular, who are trying to buy their votes by this means. And so they can't be allowed to think that they're going to get something for nothing. And this is an intensely moralistic point of view about the undeserving poor and how they're trying to take advantage of the rest of us, the real Americans, the hardworking, blue-collar working stiffs who are paying their taxes and supporting all of these welfare cheats and so on. Some of them have even been seen using food stamps to buy steak and seafood, and this is horror show. How can they do that? There has to be a way of preventing that from happening. So in the Republican platform, then you see this week what some are calling a regression to the hard right, defying the GOP autopsy of the 2012 defeat. The need then was outlined to bring more of these minorities into the Republicans' bigger tent, the Hispanics and the gays and lesbians and transsexuals and so on, and stop condemning them and moralizing against them, and realizing that you're going to need their votes too if you're ever going to win a national election again. So the theme of the preamble to the current GOP platform is entitlement society versus opportunity society. Mm-hmm. So the Democrats are pushing a entitlement society where people get all these welfare benefits, these lucky duckies who are getting lots of stuff that they haven't worked for and don't really deserve. And the opportunity society, which the Republicans are now going to offer to us, we're never told about what the opportunity to do what may be, but apparently it's just to make more money. But anyway, the liberals and Democrats are denying that to people. So here's a few more phrases from the preamble to the Republican national platform of 2016. The pursuit of opportunity has defined America from our very beginning. This is a land of opportunity. The American dream is a dream of equal opportunity for all, and the Republican Party is the party of opportunity. Today, that American dream is at risk. Our nation faces unprecedented uncertainty with great fiscal and economic challenges, and under the current administration has suffered through the longest and most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. Okay, that is the choice facing the American people this November. Every voter will be asked to choose between the chronic high unemployment and unsustainable debt produced by a big government entitlement society, or a positive, optimistic view of an opportunity society where any American who works hard, dreams big, and follows the rules can achieve anything he or she wants. So the contrast could not be more stark, could it? Some observers will tell us really between good and evil. So there it is, choose. Second point, more and more social unrest, uncertainty, agitation about coming from different groups in society who are advertising themselves as the victims of oppression. And this has become so overwhelming that maybe it's time to react just a little to this and ask whether it's going to be exaggerated. So in addition to the rape culture theme of the 70s in ultrafeminism, we now have a victim culture, it seems, growing out of 20 or 30 years of identity politics. The victims include women who are victims of patriarchy and sexism. And here's a little token of rebellion against that. This is a soap sculpture I guess it's the male chauvinist pig. It says MCP on his belt buckle. So there it is. Blacks are victims of slavery and racism. Hispanics are victims of ethnocentric bigotry. Asians are victims of a stereotype of the inscrutable Oriental mind and being called the model minority. Native Americans are victims of genocide and land theft. Jews are victims of anti-Semitism. Christians are victims of secular humanism and atheism. God has been driven out of the schools by forbidding prayer and so on. Now the policemen are victims of criminals, terrorists, and anarchists who are rebels against their legitimate authority. And finally, everybody in the entitlement society is victimized by the goddamn government, all claiming to be victims of oppression, disrespect, and therefore have a right to retaliation and revenge. And anyone who disagrees with this, of course, if any of this is accused of bias. Another note on the grievance of disrespect. Last week, a dishwasher at Yale University and Calhoun College was fired for breaking a stained glass window, which apparently depicted black cotton pickers working in the field somewhere in the South. He was fired for that. He ultimately apologized and was charged with a couple of crimes, but the whole thing is a big mess. And anyway, in Minneapolis, 4 off-duty policemen hired as security at the Minnesota Lynx WNBA game. That's the Women's Professional Basketball Association. They walked off because 3 players were wearing Black Lives Matter T-shirts. So these people are also sensitive to perceived slights and grievances and so on. It's really amazing. And are we so far sunk in this that we can no longer think straight or clearly about political matters and who is really going to be the best for the society as a whole if they achieve political office? Meanwhile, there's the matter of Nice, France, where dozens of people were killed by this truck driver striking down many people. And the response from Donald Trump this morning was, we must have a war with ISIS. And the response was very quick and indiscriminate. So I hope I've stepped on enough toes here to invite some useful dialogue. So, Karen, are you a victim of sexism and patriarchy?
Right now, I'm a victim of being bored to death by all of the corporate media stuff that you've just predicted.
Yeah.
You've just repeated it all.
Oh, I'm
it's
sorry.
all the same thing that the corporate media spews out there. Mind you, I don't watch television anymore, but I still see it, whether it's CNN or whatever. And,
Yeah.
oh, and Trump said this, Trump said. Actually, Trump saying it's time to eliminate ISIS is actually a good idea. We really should try that. But I don't think that's the government, the U.S. government. It's not in our plan, since we've been supporting them. So I'll just continue without an introduction here, Carl.
Sure, go ahead.
Since Ron brought up my name. Yeah.
It's hard to top the remarkable farrago of error and truth that we've just heard, so,
Right,
but give it a
right.
shot. Yeah.
But it's all the things that irritate me. I'm reminded of someone telling me when I started school as a student back in the 70s, I was planning initially to major in art. That was my interest. And then I found myself going towards sociology. And this person said to me, well, sociology is a waste of time. Since you just brought it up, Ron, he said he thought that cultural anthropology was more important. And while I enjoyed my cultural anthropology course, I initially went into political science under the illusion that I was actually going to learn something about a topic that truly did interest me, which is international politics, geopolitics. I've come to the conclusion that if there's any hope for our nation, it really is a cultural change. Not on the part of many people who I think are already there, but I think there are so many people that have been so blinded and taking, the corporate media responses that you're giving are rather indicative of what I see as a misplaced culture. We're a culture of violence. I don't think there's any getting away from that, whether it's domestic or whether it's international. There's this assumption that guns and militarism will solve the problem. And I think that requires a real cultural change. Because I don't see this elsewhere in the world. Yes, I see European governments, our allies, supporting us in our wars abroad, but they still don't have quite the militaristic perspective amongst the people. The German people do not support the militarism that their government is supporting. So we do see, and France is backing away. This is what we're seeing happening now in regards to NATO. Now, of course, they're talking about militarizing the EU. I can't imagine them thinking, if you're going into negotiations and you're saying we just need to disband and back away totally from NATO, nothing's going to happen, okay? But if you go in and you say, look, we need to build our own militaries and guard our own borders, or we need to build up an EU military presence, then the chances are greater that you're going to get your colleagues, comrades, to do away with NATO. And then hopefully utilize diplomacy and negotiations rather than militarism. I don't see that happening in Poland, but that's because Poland is they have such animosity towards Russia, and they are being so supported by us, by the U.S. and NATO. So while I see, I see a lot of really serious potentials for war, I am a little bit hopeful regarding the recent NATO conference. I mean, even though they come out, those supporting NATO are pretty blatantly awful in their support for it, for war, for completely surrounding Russia. Nonetheless, you do have Europeans who are looking at NATO and saying, look, they're not supporting, they're not protecting. They're not protecting our nations at all. See, at one time during the Cold War, they actually did have it within their perspective or within the agreement, at least as part of the NATO defense policies, was that diplomacy was the first action, and that they did have regulations and negotiations were to be part of it. That no longer exists. That no longer exists. It is strictly military today. Okay, back to culture change, why I think we need a culture change. And I'm not an expert on this. I have no answers, and I would like to actually hear further from more people. Where I do see some hope in the United States today, as opposed to the past, is so many people embracing socialism today. That back at one time in the 70s, before I left the country, they were a minority. They were a minority. But I think maybe enough people now have seen what capitalism has done to our nation and done to the world, that I think more and more people are going into this and at least embracing the concept. So that's all I'll say on the topic of culture. To the topic of Nice and Nice, France, where they had this devastating, I say it's devastating because it was a truck that rammed into people who were celebrating, I think it was Bastille Day.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Bastille Day, sure.
More death and they celebrate death and destruction. Okay, but they're
They're watching fireworks, basically.
Right. Well, anyway, I often question some of these holidays that we all around the world celebrate. But at any rate, it was a truck that just rammed into people and was shooting people, and you had families, you had children. So many children were killed. People were murdered, and it was pretty awful. And now the people are really angry. They want stricter enforcement of security. And unfortunately, they're blaming the police for not doing anything, and they're calling in for more of a military presence. Now, I find this really rather amazing that a nation will ask for a military presence on their land, their own military, but at the same time wanting their military to come and protect them. I mean, this is serious and it's dangerous. And it brings to question, all right, South Sudan. I think just this week, the U.S. is sending troops to southern Sudan because of the conflicts there. The goal, I think, is more separation and more control by the U.S. I won't get into too much discussion on Africa right now. We know that Africa is well, Libya was the jewel in the crown, all right, in Africa. But Africa is a jewel that the U.S. is in conflict with China over. And so where China goes in with money and investment and projects, we go in with our military presence, AFRICOM, military bases, and take over all over Africa and destroy. Which brings me then to this whole point of chaos theory. I'm a proponent of chaos theory. Pepe Escobar has written a book on it, The Empire of Chaos, which I haven't read yet, but Eric Dracer was talking about that recently, that he supports chaos theory. What that means is that when we go into places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq and Libya are two perfect examples, and we come out of it and we've left it in total chaos, and then we say, oh yeah, isn't that terrible? That was a mistake, we didn't mean for that. Actually, we did. That's exactly what we wanted. Because even if that a nation if that particular nation isn't that important to us, there may be other reasons why we have destroyed it and allowed the chaos to reign. It has been mentioned that Libya is a conduit to then we were able to go in and see to it that Mali was torn up, and we want regime change. Look what we're doing to Syria. Now we want regime change in Syria. We want Assad gone, and we're willing to destroy and create as much dissension and destruction as necessary. We have created ISIS. We are responsible for their growth. Whether one says we went in and actually hired these people, I'm not so sure about that, but I think the growth of ISIS was a natural reaction to what we have done. And I think that some of these terrorist attacks in Europe are natural reactions by people who see their lands and their people being destroyed, and I think it's to be expected. We can call it blowback, but either way, we knew, the U.S. knew that we could expect blowback. The Chilcot report in the U.K., they have really gone after Tony Blair as a result. He should be prosecuted for war crimes. Whether that will ever happen or not, but it has brought up the fact to many of the British that Tony Blair knew very well that there was going to be a lot of blowback as a result. They knew very well there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when they went in. Well, I asked the question, where's the U.S. Chilcot report? Now, let me say this about the Chilcot report. It's too little and it's too late. It took 7 years to come up with information that, Carl, I think you've been talking about it now for
That's right.
Hey, we could have given them all the information based upon just the readings that we had been doing. Andrew Cockburn could have given them everything they needed. They didn't have to do that 7-year report. And then it was somewhat whitewashed. But even then, it's like, but what are we getting? We're getting Hillary Clinton being promoted as, somehow a liberal, a woman that we want to see in power. So, I really think we need some cultural change here in the United States. We're a land of immigrants, and I think what's unfortunate is that when immigrants come here, they're rather forced to adapt. And I thought, well, okay, at least we have one united language. Having a united language is a good thing. China knew that, and that's why they made everybody really learn Mandarin rather than all the various different languages. India is not. They haven't been able to do that. They haven't been able to accomplish that, so they're not as unified. On the other hand, we've done away with Americans learning second languages and third languages when really young, when we should be learning them. So there are a lot of problems in the U.S. that maybe some cultural change taking place could rectify. I'm not sure. But as far as I can see, what's happening in the rest of the world, Bangladesh suffered a terrorist attack that was pretty horrific, and I will get into that a little more depth another time on our AWARE program, which is anti-war. There's some speculation on it, but what we have to really look at here is the big picture, all right? If we're looking at geopolitics, we have to look at the big picture. A lot of these terrorist attacks are blowback, but a lot of them, some of them are very questionable as to what is actually taking place. And what is it, cui bono? Is that how you say it? Cui bono? Thank you, gentlemen. Who profits? Who benefits?
Exactly.
Who benefits from some of these things? And I think that's very important. In the meantime, I did want to mention that, yes, I've talked so much about the tribunal, the UN law of the Convention of the Sea tribunal between the Philippines and China did come down just exactly as we knew it would, and that was in favor of the Philippines, which of course China is totally ignoring, and I won't go into any of the legal. They have a lot of legal reasons why not. I think the important thing for us to recognize is that the U.S. has warships in the South China Sea, and we have been provoking China every which way we can. Now, at the same time, Duarte, the new president of the Philippines, he's a sort of a Trump-like character. He was elected by a majority of people. He acted as a populist, but then he was also elected by the elites that want to do more business with China. All right? They do exist. And so the Philippines is rather divided, but he is not controlled by the U.S. Now, make no mistake, he does not want to fall out with the U.S. Nobody wants to fall out with us. But they are moving closer to China. And Duarte, so it's hoped that Duarte, as the president of the Philippines, he has sent former President General Ramos to sit down and have bilateral discussions with Xi Jinping in Beijing. And the reason this is important is because General Ramos, a former major general, okay, who also represents the elite, they think that he's always had close ties with China. And again, if they can probably, and I've always maintained, Asians are very good at solving their problems bilaterally. They do not need intervention from the United States for our interests that only support our elite, okay? So maybe there's hope if Trump were elected, even though he's like Duarte, being supported by people who are racist and want to build walls. Nonetheless, Trump may be representing our elite businessmen who are saying, look, this is insane what we're doing. We want to continue doing business with China. We want to continue doing business around the world and doing business with Russia. It's to our benefit. Let's hope that's the case if he wins. But I too, like you, Carl, I'm afraid that the corporate-owned media only gets the really nasty things that Trump says across to people, and so they think that they've got to go out and vote for what they see as the lesser evil, Hillary Clinton, which I don't see as the lesser evil. I see Hillary probably as the greater evil, without a doubt, given what she did when she was Secretary of State in respect to Libya and Honduras and where else? I'm sure you can come up with more things. Well, she supported the war in Iraq, so she's proven herself where she's coming from. So I'm not sure where I was going with any of this. It's unrehearsed, as you say, and so I did not come in here with any plan.
There are plenty of things to talk about here. I begin with the notion that your prescription of cultural change for the United States seems to be fine so long as that cultural change means the government stops killing people.
Right, exactly.
Because that's the real issue for the rest of the world. The fact that the United States of America, in the period of its dominance, no nation has ever been as dominant as the U.S. was after the Second World War and since then. In 2 generations, almost 3 now, of U.S. dominance, between 20 and 30 million people have died as a result of decisions by the American executive. The rest of the world knows that. Americans think, oh, well, we were just defending peace and freedom against Nazism and communism and terrorism and other bad isms. But in fact, the rest of the world sees the United States for its own purposes, for its own profit, for the benefit of its 1%, killing people literally around the world. And that is the real basis of our problems, as that dominance, that complete dominance that the U.S. had in 1945, slips away. And there's a question, it is slipping away.
Yeah.
That Asia and Europe and Africa as well, that's the reason we have troops in every nation in Africa but two. All of these regions are, in their various ways, asserting themselves against U.S. control in various ways, and that is the shape of the future. Cultural change is the sort of cultural change, in a sense, that President Putin is talking about. The U.S. has got to realize that it needs to work in partnership with these other nations, not treat them as subordinates who can be casually killed. And that's the change we need, and it's pretty basic.
The important piece here is it's global dominance and not merely regional.
That the U.S. exercises. Absolutely. This is what we've talked on this panel before about the remarkable relevance of the so-called Mackinder thesis, the views put forth at the very beginning of the 20th century by a British academic about the extent to which the U.S. and the U.K., although he didn't put it quite that way, needed to control Central Asia, needed to control Eurasia, because if any real challenge to their dominance arose, it would arise there. And that American policy, from the open door to China through the invasion of Russia after the First World War, down to present-day activities, are based on the notion that the U.S. cannot allow an economic integration of the Eurasian landmass to proceed in a way that would counter that would interfere with the profits of the American 1%. This is so true that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the American government moved immediately to reduce Russia to the status of a third world country, to produce an economic depression in Russia far greater than the Great Depression in the United States, and indeed even to reduce the life expectancy of the average Russian by a substantial amount in those years. Now, this overwhelming world strategy by the U.S., as I say, which reaches back more than 100 years, that remains very much the same today because the interests remain the same. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, said the 19th century about the government of Britain. The U.S. has followed the same rule, even though it has always been presented to the principal enemy of the American government, that is the American people, under covers of propaganda that suggests that the U.S. government is acting for the benefit of humanity and particularly for the benefit of all Americans. I began the program tonight by saying that it seemed to me that we were in the midst of a crisis of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And it seems to me that the specifics that have been mentioned in the last half hour all are indeed aspects of that crisis. I have a note here about how to talk about that crisis. It's being referred to now in the literature as the demand problem of neoliberalism. The notion is that neoliberal capitalism, that is the reassertion of the rights of capital, the reassertion of capitalism in the political sphere in the last generation or so, that neoliberal capitalism had at its core a basic contradiction. Rising profits, which was the point of neoliberalism, spurred economic expansion, globalization we called it under neoliberalism.
Economic growth.
Economic growth, but at the same time the source of the rising profits, the suppression of wage growth, the fundamental point of neoliberalism is that if wage growth was suppressed, then obviously more profits flowed to the owners. The graphs in this are quite striking. if you look at productivity, production per worker, from 1945 to the early 70s in the United States, it's a constantly rising graph, and it parallels the rise in wages. At the point that neoliberalism became a conscious policy in the early 70s, the productivity graph continues to rise, but wages turn flat. Wages in America have been essentially flat since 1973. And this is an epochal change, a major change, a change that was not an accident. It was not sort of the natural working out of invisible hands. They were very visible hands, and they belonged to the United States Chamber of Commerce. They belonged to the 1%. They were working hard, writing laws, and administering an economy and a polity in which this sort of effect would be the result. There was a problem with what they were doing, though, because the very thing that produced the wage growth created an obstacle to expansion. With wages stagnating, as they were after 1973, and with government spending rising more slowly, point of neoliberalism, no more government spending, we don't want public works projects and things like that, who would buy the output of the expanding economy? For a while, this simmering demand problem was forestalled as risk-seeking financial institutions extended credit to hard-pressed families whose wages were stagnating and falling. We saw that primarily in the housing market. Your wages are going down, your wages are the same, but you still need to buy a house. You think you have to buy a house. The housing prices are going up because there's a lot of money floating around to buy houses, but you're not getting it because your wages have been stopped. Debt-fueled consumer spending made long expansions possible from the 70s through the 90s, despite the stagnation of wages and of government spending. Big asset bubbles provided the collateral enabling families to borrow to pay their bills, once again, most notably in housing. The economic crisis of 2008 marked the end of the ability of the neoliberal form of capitalism to promote stable economic expansion. In the wake of the massive housing bubble collapse and financial crisis, the previous debt and bubble-based growth machine cannot be revived. The banks continue to find new speculative ventures and corporate profits remain high, but the process no longer brings normal economic expansion. That's the demand problem. Now, there's some funny aspects of this problem. For the first time since I was a youth, I have heard people speaking of the way of to dealing with the demand problem. The way to deal with the demand problem is give people money, and they spend it, and that's the demand. This was nothing new. Lord Keynes said this at the beginning of the 20th century. Milton Friedman, the conservative economist, said this in the middle of the century. He called it helicopter money. But for the first time in a long time, we have political figures in Europe and the United States saying the problem of the lack of demand is keeping the economy from growing. We've got to produce demand. How do we do it? Before we did it by government spending. We can't do that anymore. We're going to give money to people to buy things. That's demand. Now, this is the sort of thing that, in a slightly different form, is condemned as free stuff that Ron was talking about before. But the point is the people who are most in favor of free stuff right now, in the sense of a universal basic income, money to those who don't have it in order to buy, are conservative economists who are saying this is the only way we can keep aggregate demand going, the only way we can keep the economy going. So the sorts of things that Ron was talking about the Republican platform are saying has a certain old-fashioned air to it, and enough conservative economists formerly associated with the Republican Party are aware of this and are abandoning this sort of notion. So we may see some interesting arguments about these things and that would be improved by a description of the economy as it exists now, not as these elderly economists remember it in their youth.
Yeah. Well, there's still a lot of moralism out there, it seems to me, that these people must work hard and learn the value of a dollar. And this, I think, is at least part of the basis of the judgment of the second quintile on the first, that they're not being taught this lesson about life. Work hard, follow the rules, and maybe you'll get somewhere.
One of the things that bothers me, and I'm pulling back over here now away from the talk of neoliberalism, which I think you hit it right on the head there, to culture, was that in the 60s there was a movement to looking outside of our boundaries, looking at what we were doing to people in Vietnam. And it began a really strong, what I call anti-war but anti-establishment movement. And I felt that this was very positive. And I was one of those naive people I didn't have the perspective on history that some had. My friends kind of warned me. They said, oh, Karen, there's always a backlash. And of course, they were quite right. But what I didn't recognize later in the 70s was this strong movement that people referred to as the navel gazing in California, which became all about me, became very narcissistic. It became very introspective, and how, we just embrace peace within ourselves. And while there's truth to that element, at some point in life, we have to come out of ourselves, okay? And we have to start looking at the bigger picture. So I left the country, then I come back years later. I'm on the treadmill wherever I'm at in the nation, and I'm watching Oprah, because I'm usually on the treadmill at the same time they have the TV screen on us, and it's Oprah.
Literally and figuratively, right?
And at first I thought, wow, she's done a great job. She's got all these, but soccer mom white women, okay, embracing her black identity. And I thought, wow, this is really a good thing. But then I also saw something else that disturbed me, and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. I now see it as really promoting capitalism and neoliberalism, because she was really into this introspection. Look into yourself, and if you can do it, come out of yourself. Anybody can be successful, as she gives away a free car here or there, which I think bothered me because it was like people winning the lottery. It's like one person. I mean, this is so capitalist, okay? And that, yes, there are always going to be some who are successful and make a lot of money, and the rest of you down in the dregs trying to survive, struggling to survive, too bad. You didn't win the lottery. So I began to look at that aspect. Now, I don't want to fault Oprah or people who watch Oprah, because there is some good to it, but I'm pointing out that I began to see how there was so much of what I could view as being this throwing culture at us, that we have to, again, it's identity politics, and how we have to, go into ourselves, and it doesn't really allow us to come outside of ourselves. So I see it as very narcissistic, and I think that's what's happened to us as a society in many ways, is, okay, the world, we need more peace. I mean, the hippie movement, okay, we had the communes and an attempt at organic foods and care for the environment. So a lot of that did evolve from the 60s movement, but then there was a lot of it just drugs and like I said, drugs and sex, free sex, and and just focusing on the self again. Sorry, man, I know you. But there were a lot of the communes that were abusive towards women and children. And trust me, I've talked with people who went through that. So it was not all perfect. It was not like even Noam Chomsky has talked about the abuse of the kibbutzim in Israel. Now, his idea of abuse was that everybody read the same newspaper, everybody embraced the same political attitudes, but at least there was some control over how people and children were. That was less apt to happen because there was some control. Many of the communes in America became really abusive of women and children. But I don't want to get into that. I just want to say that good things came out of it, but some very not so good things, and I think it's part of this narcissism that the United States has embraced. And I take this to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is experiencing a lot of the heat now. They're being blamed for the shooting of the policeman in Dallas. They're being blamed for the violence because they're simply trying to stand up and start a movement to protect black people in black and poor communities. Now, I keep trying to point out to people that, right, they're going after black people now, but they're going to come after white people if you're poor later.
Yeah.
I mean, they are doing that in many ways. They utilize soft power as well as hard power. And this whole, the imprisonment of people, and the fact that today there are now warnings being issued by other nations in the world against travel to the United States.
Yeah.
Just warning people, especially young men, especially if you're a young black man, it's very dangerous here.
Yeah.
And I think there was a photo that was circulating on Facebook that really brings it together. You've got one young black woman standing there dressed in a lovely dress, and she's just standing there, I think, with her hands clasped, being confronted by 5 policemen with and they're surrounded in the background, and they are dressed in military, I mean, from head to toe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
In armor.
in armor.
Mm-hmm.
So when you send people out just dressed like that as policemen to protest, what are they? I mean, they're dressed to kill. They're literally dressed. They think they're going to be killed, so they're dressed to kill. And this here
In
again.
happier days, that phrase
just-
was used differently.
Right, that is
I
the
know,
meaning, yeah.
but they are being dressed to kill, and so you're sending people in under the idea. I mean, they're not going out thinking that they're going to accept a flower from some hippie. They think they're going to be shot down because of the way they're dressed, and to assume that one man who was insane and shot them, that this was a plot by anybody. Black Lives Matter, or that they were Black Lives Matter is trying to bring peace to the nation. So we saw this in the 60s, and I think it's much worse today because the violence is getting worse and worse, both here and there, and it is connected.
You think the police now have their own victim story?
Of course.
Yeah. Where does cultural change come from, Karen?
Oh, well, it has to come from below. That's the thing.
Below.
It doesn't come from above, and there is the problem. It has to come from below. Everything must come from below. So it's about people embracing peace and love, but I'm more into the politics of recognizing what the problems are, where the problems are coming from, and how do we solve these problems. And I think the first thing is to demilitarize. So
So by cultural change, you really mean a change in political ideas, eh?
well,
Ideas
yes.
about how the society should be organized.
Well,
Ideas
my
about how
idea-
the economy should be organized.
I think they would evolve from culture change. I think the idea that Americans have that they have to go around carrying guns everywhere, I mean, and open carry. I mean, I'm sorry, if I walk into a supermarket and there's a guy there and he's open carrying a weapon,
Shoot him.
no,
Yeah.
I'm gonna run away. I
That's
mean,
a-
how do you know what he's doing? I mean, to me, this is insanity.
Yeah.
This is insanity, and this is what our culture today is perpetuating.
More people are becoming conscious of this problem of friendly fire. All these people carrying guns around. There were people in each of these incidents who had guns but refused to get them out and show them because they were afraid they'd be shot by the police, where there's an active shooter situation.
Well, it's
And not an
it's-
unreasonable fear either.
right.
Exactly. But I mean, it's total nonsense. What we have to do is lessen the weapons. But you can't lessen the weapons until you lessen the mindset that we have to solve our problems with guns and violence.
How does cultural changes come about? Are they just spontaneous mutations, or does somebody have to take the lead consciously?
Well, I would like to see someone take the lead, and that's why I support the Green Party, because we know if we get Hillary as president, it's not going to happen. And I hate to say this, but we know if Trump, it's not going to happen. But at least we know with Jill Stein of the Green Party, that would be taking a lead, even if it's only symbolic, of demilitarizing and lessening violence.
That's an
And,
interesting point, particularly since we heard this week that with the abject ending of the Sanders campaign, and the hopes that it had
Right.
encouraged led to a massive increase in contributions to Jill Stein, the putative presidential candidate of the Green Party, and to the Green Party in general. That, in other words, there's a sentiment out there, perhaps the sentiment you're looking for cultural change, that is looking for an agent, looking for some way to actualize the sorts of things in the society that they want. A lot of people are turning to third parties now, and the major parties are aware of this and are extremely worried about it. One of the things we'll see in the
Right.
next couple of weeks is the major parties attempting to regain the allegiances of the Americans who normally would naturally support the major party, because after all, they're the major parties. The exodus from the major parties may be the most important political event, maybe even cultural event, of this political season. I would disagree a little with Ron on the notion, I don't disagree a lot with Ron, but I mean, on the notion that the relationship of the bottom 20, the contempt for the bottom 20% shown by the next 20% of the population is the fundamental political problem. It is a political problem. I don't deny it for a moment. It's a problem that's been used by the elites in various ways, back to the civil rights movement, back to the Civil War as far as that goes. But the important 20% is not the bottom 20% or the next 20%, it's the top 20%. This is nothing new. The top 20% has been called the political class for more than a century, because that's the sort of thing we have in capitalist states. But who controls that 20% is a crucial issue for the 1%. They have managed to do so by a combination of economic manipulation and propaganda literally for generations throughout the century, throughout the last century. But that's what's coming apart. And that's what's interesting. We've mentioned before here the important study by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. It was published last year, which tried to test how important your political opinions were on the actions taken by your government, local, state, and national. And it found a remarkable division in the society, that people who belonged to that top 20% did indeed have their ideas and concerns taken account of by the governmental structures. Below that 20%, it didn't happen. 80% of the community simply had no purchase whatsoever. And the pun is important because it's literal and figurative. No purchase whatsoever on the political system. Now, what's happening is that comfortable situation for the 1%, presiding over a political structure in which the next 20% so much wants to be like the 1% that they'll do what they're told, that's what's come apart. That when the word socialism can indeed be used in American political discourse again, when indeed we have an election coming up, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump's character, regardless of what you think of Hillary Clinton's character, the fact of the matter is that we have Republican and Democratic presidential candidates this year who do not agree that the principles of neoliberalism and neoconservatism are sacred. And that has not happened. The last time it happened in a presidential election was the early 70s. The McGovern-Nixon election in 1972 actually involved in a change in the language, arguments about neoliberalism and neoconservatism. That hasn't happened since then. Every presidential election since then, the candidates have paid homage to the principles of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, simply suggested that the other side was less able to activate those principles than they themselves were. Now, this year, for the first time, we have Trump, whatever you think of his character, criticizing the neoconservative, the pro-military principles of Mrs. Clinton, and the neoliberal principles, the globalization and trade pact principles. This is a serious problem for the Clintons, and therefore they've done their best to make the argument be about Trump's bigotry. That doesn't matter. What matters are the political principles that may be decided in this political election. What's worse from the point of view of our leaders is that the top 20% is hearing about it for the first time. Right. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 28th week of 2016, a worse than you thought edition. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Ehrman and Ron Zook. Our thanks to our directors and producers, Jason Liggett and Joseph Kosh. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. Remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.